The recording is in progress, which is always the first step on the yellow brick road to success, or in this case, the torn up yellow brick road of success. Hello, I'm John McDonald, and as we are in spooky season, it's time to talk spooky movies. When we started this podcast, me and Magnus last year, whenever it was we started this podcast, we started it around December. So we didn't get a chance to talk spooky movies. So this is our
Mm.
first opportunity to do so. And I chose a spectacular dark fantasy kids film, which is close to my heart. It's probably not the spookiest dark fantasy kids film that Disney put out, but it's the one I like more than any of the others. Today, Magnus and I are going to be talking about Return to Oz from 1985. Hello, Magnus.
Greetings, greetings. What a subject to choose for a Halloween episode. From what I understand, that this traumatized many, many young viewers when they first saw this.
See, and I'm always more traumatized. In fact, I'm so traumatized by the never-ending story franchise that I can't even watch it. Return to Oz, I'm fine with. It's probably because a lot of the things that I like about horror movies are kind
Mm,
of a part of this film. And the
mm.
things that people hated in '85 that turned this into one of those cult classics are things I actually really like about it. Not to mention the fact that it's a super gay movie. So that doesn't hurt at all.
Yeah. So actually never seen this movie. I know of it by reputation. Um, I think it's one of those things that sort of passed us by here in the UK. Whereas I've always got the sense that Oz has a bit more of a fan base in the States, being as you know, it's a there's a lot of metaphors
Yeah.
within the stories.
Oz itself is an Americana fairy tale. I even think L. Frank
Yeah,
Baum is an American author. It's really the
yeah.
only fairy tale that I can think of, except for maybe the Don Bluth Bible movies, that
Mm,
is pure Americana. The 1939 film, the people have a critique of Dorothy coming home at the end of it, which she also does at the end of this movie. Spoiler,
mm,
sorry. But that's kind of the brand of the Oz books and
mm,
most of the Oz films is the idea of going out, having the journey, learning
yeah.
stuff, and then returning home. It has a very classic fairy tale feel, and the two books, Return to Oz, are based on our later Oz novels when Frank Baum was
Mm.
very tired and didn't want to do it anymore, like the Sherlock Holmes guy, and people would just not let him stop. So even though we have 40, not all of them are the same. And if you're a fan of
Mm.
Riff Tracks or Mystery Science Theater 3000, they've done other Oz books that were made into bad films, which Return to Oz is not one of. I don't think you could actually Riff Tracks this movie. I think it's actually so well done and so dystopian that it should
Mm.
qualify as full horror. I don't know that I think this is a dark fantasy. I really do think this is a horror film, and I feel pretty strongly about that. So
But this is probably a good time to mention the fact that this is another sign of the fact that it, with the Wizard of Oz, and from what I can see, many of my contemporaries here in the UK, we were always just aware of the one Oz book, like the Wizard of Oz. I'm fairly certain quite a few people around wouldn't realize that it was the first book in a series. You mentioned about the 40 before. So of those 40, I believe 14 were directly written by Frank L. Brom during his lifetime. I mean, 14 books alone in one season
yeah.
series is a pretty
Uh,
decent thing. Um,
Also, this the Oz series is the first mention outside of the poem about Santa.
hmm.
Parts of Santa mythology are actually from one of the Wizard of Oz books where he introduces Santa, and that's one of the rarest and hardest to find. I saw the cover of it once, and someone was like, "I'm going to charge $3,000 for this."
Well,
So there's a lot of Americana
mm,
inside. But Dorothy's Gale journey to Oz always comes from her leaving the heartland and going somewhere, and then there's an earthquake or a hurricane or a tornado Like something befalls her, and then she's like, "Oh, I'm back in Oz. What a fairy story!" So like by the fifth one, you can just tell how tired L. Frank Baum is, and he's
Mm,
just like, "Okay, so now she's going with her Uncle Henry to Australia, and there's going to be a hurricane, and then she's in Oz, which is part of Oz of Ozma, which is what half of this movie is based on." Yeah.
so I think that's a good point to start with this. So everyone knows Wizard of Oz and the subsequent classic, the dare I say cult classic film that sprung from it. Um, what is this film then?
This film is an unofficial sequel, and that's what they call it. But I just call it an adaptation.
Hmm.
It's more straight from the two books it lifts off of. Return to Oz is it is a hybrid of the Marvelous Land of Oz and
Okay.
Ozma of Oz. And
Mm,
so all of the characters you meet in this, Belina the talking hen, Tick Tock, the first automaton on film almost, Jack
mm,
Pumpkinhead, the Gump, Princess Ozma, and even the versions here of the Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Tin Woodsman, and the Lion are
mm.
all more accurate to the book. Because this is a book to, if you were looking, if you're doing an adaptation college course on how to adapt something successfully,
Mm.
Return to Oz is pretty quintessential in how you adapt without messing up your source material and making it
Okay.
essentially what MGM did. Because the MGM film was based on a stage play, not based on the book itself. The 1939
Oh.
movie is based on a stage musical that then became the 39 movie, but it was MGM. And Disney right now in 85 had they had really just started Touchstone Pictures, which was supposed to be
Mm.
a more teen, a more adult imprint. It gave us Splash and things like that. So
Yeah.
Return to Oz was really about it being slightly more comfortable doing quote unquote darker dark fantasy, labyrinth, willow type of things.
So would you say this is still aimed at a child audience, or were they trying to tap into the teenage market?
I think for Disney, almost everything is about tapping into the kid market, but when people heard Touchstone in 85, I think they had an idea that this was something you'd have to go to see with your kids. Like you couldn't leave like my parents, my family used to drop me off for like a 10-cent matinee of like Rockadoodle from Don Bluth and then come back in 3 hours. Return to Oz, you actually had to go with
Mm.
your parents to see. This movie did not make a ton of money. It only gained cult status after it flopped in the theaters. And
Mm.
interestingly enough, internationally, this is a very well loved movie. And I don't know what that means. That's what the Wikipedia page says. But it took a long time for people to kind of discover why this movie works, and it does.
Mm.
From the set to the deathly terrifying Wheelers to the wall of heads from Princess Mombi. This movie is it's hard to believe this lives in the same universe as
Mm.
1939 MGM Wizard of Oz. It almost seems, and that's because the book it's the one of the books it's based on takes place in the land of Ev, not the land of Oz. So where like the Gnome King actually rules in the books is not in
Ah,
Oz. So the
right.
reason it has a different vibe is because it actually isn't. They call it Oz, but that's only because they were hybriding two books, really.
I was going to say, so they're hybriding two books. So does it create a completely different story, or does it appear? Does it create a story that works well, or can you see the stitches with the two plots joined together?
I think it's really elegant. If anything, it makes me think it's more a spiritual prequel, essentially, to Wicked the book.
Okay.
There's something very dystopian in Wicked the book that you get in Return to Oz.
Mm,
The size of the land here is much smaller. It's almost like the 39 film is this big, grandiose storybook. And even though Dorothy's in it, in this
mm,
version, Fairuza Balk is Dorothy. whereas Judy Garland had these like amazingly sweet, endearing, caring
Mm,
eyes. Fairuza Balk's eyes have this sort of like touched, almost fey
mm,
changeling energy to them. Um, and she wasn't trying to copy Judy. She talked about this in that she was trying to do her own thing, but they have similar type of eyes, and they've essentially tried to dress her like Dorothy. They gave her pigtails, they put her in check gingham like they had Dorothy in. They gave her a lunch pail to mimic the basket. Bellina the talking hen is a Toto archetype essentially,
mm.
but it talks and it allows Dorothy to explain what part of Oz they're in, which is really nice.
So,
It's one of those things where she comes back to Oz. Her first question is, "Oh, so here's the house. Where are the Munchkins?" So
mm,
like she remembers Oz being different, and it's like in coming back and seeing as how it's really spiritually close to what would later come in like American McGee's Alice video game series, where it takes
mm,
something with a lot of wonder and it really breaks it down into like a psychological thing. And that can be really hard for people that love the 1939 movie because this is not wistful. Like there's electroshock therapy.
oh,
Uh, you're pretty sure the Wheelers are going to literally eat Dorothy like zombies because they're basically bird creatures. And like Princess Mombi is unsettling because you meet her and she's like playing this mandolin in this room made of mirrors, and she will not even look at Dorothy for the first 5 minutes. It's beautifully upsetting in like the best way. This if Wizard of Oz is like Glinda the Good Witch, this is like the shrieking
wow.
of the East. And it's amazing. It's everything you want out of a kid's dark fantasy. It's Coraline, essentially. It's everything you want out of a
Hmm,
dark fantasy movie that pushes right to the edge of what kids can really accept on their own terms. If
mm.
you like Coraline, Return to Oz is probably something you like more than Nightmare Before Christmas, if I'm honest.
It sounds like one of those movies. From what you're saying, it's got very like strong visual concepts embedded throughout the movie, and scenes which stay with the viewer after they watched it. We haven't really discussed previously about the fact that things that make an impression on you as a kid can like surface later on back in life and make you go back to what you experienced and watch it again. Um, do you think that might have been partially what happened here? That um, because this made such an impact on the audience that saw it at the time, it stuck with them. That's why it slowly became a cult classic, despite the fact it didn't do well so much on release.
Yeah, kids like me that are more Return to Oz kids, like Never Ending Story for me was terrifying. But I
Right,
can watch Return to Oz, even though Return to Oz has some of those same terrifying concepts. The idea of getting turned into an ornament,
right.
the idea of these wheelers that are terrifying and grotesque and
Mm,
don't present as human right away. And then when they are human, basically they're like Power Ranger putties in a way, except they can talk a little bit. But there's something very vicious, but it's approachable. Where in like the Never Ending Story series, you have nightmare-inducing things like potential physical abuse from the dad. It's hard to tell from that scene. The
mm,
machine that steals your memories, the lake of acid, the horse dying in the swamp. You don't get that in Return to Oz. It's a
mm,
little gentler. Like they do talk about the deadly desert, and you do see some people getting turned to sand, but a machine that takes your memories without your permission, a la Never Ending Stories, something about that is more viscerally unsettling. So Return to
mm,
Oz is a
mm,
much more fairy tale, like dark fairy tale. It's much easier to digest. And also, because I'm a big fan of claymation, there are some great claymation scenes in here, especially with the Gnome King and the Gnome King's like mountain assistants that are basically faces in stone that you get these great shots of where no one else sees them until it's too late.
mm,
Or they're talking to the Gnome King. And for people that like really old school techniques like puppet work and claymation. This one is really good because it didn't have CGI to rely on, um,
mm,
and I think that makes it stronger because you get a sense, like in Jumanji, where you
Mm.
got a sense of things physically present in the world.
Yeah.
Um, and that really works here in Return to Oz. I think Return to Oz, I don't know if it's a better movie than The Never Ending Story. I think in competition, maybe Never Ending Story might be more compelling, but it's also more frightening to me. Like as an adult, I still can't watch the Never Ending Story movies.
So,
I love Return to Oz.
so you mentioned about Return to Oz having a bit more of a fairy tale esqueness to it.
Oh yeah.
Um, I wonder whether now this is from me not having seen Return to Oz and such, so I might be coming up with stuff out of the blue just based on what you're saying. But I almost wonder whether it sounds like there's more a feeling more direct peril from the never-ending story, and the inclusion of the horse dying
Yeah.
like so viscerally on screen, for example, that sort of drives home the fact that this is a very dangerous world for that the young, even for kids journeying through it. Whereas because Return to Oz still had a more of a creepy fairy tale vibe to it, it may I'm not I'm not sure how to phrase what I'm saying. And maybe I'm just trying to wonder if that's maybe where the line is drawn. That there's a bit more of a directness to the peril in Neverending Story compared to what sounds like present within um, Return to Oz.
I think what makes Return to Oz different is twofold. One is that Return to Oz, even in this movie, Fairuza Balk has this great uh, butch femme energy, even at a
Mm,
young age. You can totally see why she was cast as Nancy in The Craft much later in life. But there's this really great energy that Balk brings that makes this movie slightly more feminine than Never Ending Story. So it is slightly more femme. There's a lot more feminization. Never Ending
mm,
Story is very masculine, very butch in a lot of ways. Um, but Return to Oz is also nice because it doesn't assume that you know things. Belina the Talking Hen and Dorothy actively don't know things, and especially when they arrive at Oz and see if things are different, they go exploring and they ask questions the audience has. And so they spend time confused, but then those questions get answered. It's much more
mm,
elegant to me as a story, especially one crafted more for kids. It doesn't assume what you know about magic, but it doesn't talk down to you.
mm.
Um, there's the great scene with the powder of life that brings the Gump, who's like this green moss moose, to life. Dorothy, they literally like, Dorothy, read the instructions on the back of the box. And that's such a kid thing to do. But it works because
Mm,
Dorothy's like, I've never used this before. What do I do with it? And it's great. Um, so like, it doesn't feel like a movie that talks down to you. It feels like a
mm,
movie that you're in it. Whereas the Neverending Story always kind of felt to me like a movie I was watching. The
mm,
Return to Oz felt like a story that I was kind of interloping in. There's some really beautiful shots in Return to Oz where they actually have POV of Dorothy as she's barreling down the yellow brick road in panic because Oz has changed. There are no munchkins. Her beloved yellow brick road, the iconic yellow brick road, is all torn up, and she's just running down pell mell, complete terror and panic in her face because this beautiful imaginary world that she keeps so secret or has tried
mm,
to keep secret has changed. Um, and there's these great tracking shots like on the ground at her feet going forward and then at the level of her eyes you get disoriented in this forest that's smaller than the one that she was in. There's no poppy field on the way to Oz. It doesn't have that storybook feel. It's a really cool way to kind of go from this depression era Kansas and this very small town. I think actually the name of the city that she lives in is Lincoln, which is more of a Nebraska thing, but she's still in Kansas
mm.
when she's in Kansas, which is it's an interesting thing. Or no, it's Franklin. Sorry, it's Franklin, not the town she's in is called Franklin, not Lincoln. But yeah, so I think for me, Never Ending
Mm.
Story, I can't think of a scene in Never Ending Story where I felt submerged. There's no POV camera work in Neverending. So in a way, Neverending is more hands off. It's not a fairy tale that's being read to you that you're imagining yourself in. And Return to Oz, you can imagine yourself in there because you're going to have these same questions. Where is the scarecrow? Where are the
Mm,
iconic characters when she sees the lion and the lion has been turned to stone? Like, Fairuza Balk's heart like breaks as Dorothy. Like, she tries to like hug him back to life. And it's this amazing like
mm,
moment where it's both child logic, but it's also that kind of beautiful heartbreak, that reminder of how things were left at the end of the 39 movie, was that
mm,
she left these people behind and now she has to deal with the PTSD of, if I hadn't left them behind, would this have happened? And Return to Oz is very elegant about that.
mm. So you mentioned the theme of dystopia in this film, and it sounds like it runs throughout this film quite strongly, but I believe it runs as a theme throughout the Oz books in general. Um,
Yeah.
why do you think that that's such a strong theme for both the movie and the books as a whole?
Well, the books themselves are really, and Return to Oz especially celebrates this. This is the idea of turn of the century. Most of the Oz books were written between 1900 and 1910, let's say. And
Mm,
so there's kind of this turn of the century. What is the next 100 years going to look like? They talk here in kind of when they're at the doctor's place where the electroshock is going to happen. The idea of electricity is new. And like Fairuza
mm,
Balk is startled by an electric light bulb, not because she hasn't seen one before, but because she has to flip a light switch, and it's just not something organic to Dorothy Gale necessarily.
mm.
It's this really great play on the idea of not rural versus urban. It's not like a Pokemon thing, but it's like
Uh,
rural versus urban in that there's this fantasy land that doesn't run on electricity but runs on magic. And what does that kind of mean? And I don't think it's also not unexpected that all of kind of the evil villain characters from the mental asylum where Antem drops off Dorothy without knowing it's really a mental asylum because it's 1900. They all show up again as kind of the evil characters. The Doctor shows up as the Gnome King.
mm,
The Wicked Witch slash Mombi of this film is the nurse, and the orderly assistant is the head wheeler. And so there's that great kind of, it doesn't ask the question, can fairy tales exist in modern times, because it has a character like TikTok, which is this great
mm,
robot automaton, but it's also a wind up robot automaton. It
mm,
doesn't like run on electricity. You actually have to wind keys in the back like it's a toy. Um, it's a really interesting, because it's not asking a question, but it's making a statement about things. It's kind of like Meet Me in St. Louis, where Meet Me in St. Louis goes more nostalgic about
mm,
St. Louis. Return to Oz has a question that it wants the viewer to think about kind of this idea of being turn of the century. And even though in 1939 the Wizard of Oz movie came out and it was talking about the Depression, at the turn of the century, 1900, American life wasn't that great. I don't think we'd had
no.
World War One yet, so we hadn't had our first post-war boom. And people were still living in a very rural places. A lot of people didn't
Mm,
have even running water. So the way the Oz books and this movie is crafted really examines the idea of um, not poverty, but of the idea of, here Oz is less grand. It's still grand, but it's grand in a way that is achievable for a
mm,
kid that's always lived on a farm. That like this is the most grand she could dream of. It has like women dancing like the Greek statues that could turn into stone. The even the opulence of the castle with its many mirrored rooms is essentially like these mirrors with bronze framing around them, but it's a mirrored castle. It's a wonderfully different, almost look at the idea of what poverty is and does for a girl from the farmland. I don't want to read too much into that could be of course adult subtext too.
Mm.
Because it is essentially a fairy tale for kids. It's a dark fairy tale, but it's a fairy tale for like kids, older kids, and teens that can handle things. But it has a darker tone, but it has a darker tone with the purpose. It's not just darker because people are like, oh, we have to. It's not like Harry Potter 5, where everything is both tinged darker and like half the people die.
Yeah. The Potter books in the terms of aesthetics themselves would, oof, that would be quite a discussion to have at some point. But
Yeah.
if that we ever feel like tackling that one. Um, I do wonder whether the the first Oz book always came across as more fantastical, and in a way almost straightforward fairy tale. Um, whereas the by the sounds of it, the following books take a more cynical turn almost. It almost sounds as if you have a child who's created a fantasy world. And now this is where partially one question I've always had is Oz a pure fantasy world like Wonderland is existing within someone's imagination, or is there an element of reality to it as a faraway land sort of thing? It's a bit vague in a sense exactly how closely the existence of Oz is tied to Dorothy and her wishing, as it were. But I wonder whether the following books, as we see Oz breaking down in many ways, and the sort of the breaking of different dreams and almost like notions, your notion of fairy tale is being challenged by the harshnesses you're going through. Um, I
Well,
wonder if that feeds into it cynically.
Oz always stops Dorothy from traveling somewhere not on our plane of existence.
Mm,
So there's one book where there's an earthquake as she's traveling to San Francisco. And so
mm,
it's always when she's going somewhere else with someone that she ends up in Oz. And
okay.
so it could be a security blanket, but you have to bear in mind for this movie in particular,
Okay.
Walt Disney bought the rights, bought the film rights to The Wizard of Oz in 1954 that they were going to use for a television series that never got
Right.
made. And so a part of Return to Oz is that they didn't want to lose the rights. And so
Okay.
at that point, they were just kind of desperate to make something happen, anyways. And they paid a lot of money for the one scene with the ruby red slippers in it, because the ruby red slippers are
Mm,
canonically lost throughout most of the film. They only
okay.
appear in one or two scenes. She doesn't have a way back home when she gets there. As
Mhm.
far as she knows, there's no exit to Oz this time. And considering that she almost ended up in electroshock therapy, which the blonde girl that rescues her is like, this stuff scrambles people's brains. We gotta run. Um, it's a really interesting idea of in the first movie you get kind of that scientist magician guy with the green elixir.
Yeah.
Uh, and here you have like this kind of mad scientist character who doesn't really know he's evil, but he gets cast as the bad guy,
Mm.
and then he gets burned to death off screen because of an electrical fire, and he's the only one that won't leave his machines. Um,
Oof.
and M talks about that. Sorry if I'm spoiling this for anybody, but like the end of the movie is wild. Like the nurse is being like dragged to jail, a la Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and Auntie M just like offhandedly says, yeah, so the doctor didn't want to leave his machine, so we burned to death in the fire, but everyone else is fine. Lol. Um, yeah, so
Wow.
that she returns to that in Kansas. And the idea of Toto finds her. Toto doesn't get to go to Kansas, and I get the feeling that he's a little miffed about it because he tries so hard to follow her to the insane asylum. Um, and he just gets. I don't know why they decided not. They made Uncle Henry kind of like this weird, not drunk but very like lazy, broken man character, so that he wouldn't get involved with sending Dorothy to the insane asylum, which is a
Okay.
choice. Uh, but NTM is really just trying to. So the whole thing is that it's not about the fact that she talks about Oz. That is alarming. The whole thing is that she hasn't slept for 6 months. Is kind of the conceit of why they want to get rid of Oz. Not because her spouting these fairy tales is like offering the community that we know of, but it's about the fact that like she can't sleep anymore. She's had these dreams of Oz. It's 6 months after that initial
Right.
tornado.
So she, sorry, sorry to interrupt. So
Yeah.
Dorothy can't sleep because she keeps dreaming of Oz and it interrupts her sleep. And this has been going on for 6 months.
It's not clarified if it's like a terrifying interruption or if she's getting like messages from Oz.
Okay.
But the conceit is that she's talking about Oz. She hasn't become a town pariah, but it might be getting there. And it really is. Auntie M is like talking with Henry at the beginning of the movie, like she hasn't slept for 6 months. We don't have another choice. We have to like the reality of the situation is their old house was dumped in Oz and they're trying to build a new house and their kid can't sleep. Um so it's a whole thing about the reality of the world is that Dorothy for Auntie M, Dorothy can't continue to slip in Oz. They need her here doing the chores, which she does in the film. This is part of it where it's a kid's story, where it's a fantasy, is kind of the reasoning behind getting her to electroshock therapy is obviously it's a little wallpapered, and that's
Yeah.
okay in the case of this movie. It's not like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory where there was a 10-minute song about poverty, which I absolutely hate. This is much more elegant, but I think that's just part of how movies framed kids stuff um, in that time period. I think if someone did Return to Oz now, it would be
Hmm.
completely different. But it was
Yeah.
it was something they were trying. It's not unsuccessful. It's not so distracting until you start pulling the thread. But it's the
Mm.
idea of Dorothy is very troubled. She's the only person that's had this experience. It's not even a question of if people believe her or not. It's how is she going to exist in the real world now
Mm.
if all she can talk
Right.
about is Oz?
Mm.
And the only thing we know at the beginning of the movie is not that Oz is in trouble. She doesn't really know that, but that she
No.
can't stop thinking about the place she left behind.
I love that there's a connotation that, like this remembrance of Oz, these messages from Oz, wherever it is, it sounds like it's slowly driving her barmy.
I
Like
mean,
it's
it's Fairuza Balk's eyes, where Judy Garland's eyes had this like warmth and tenderness to them. Fairuza
mm,
Balk has that, but there's also this touch of having seen and done something other people can't. Like when she looks at the camera straight on, and you get this great close up of her face in the beginning. There's a way she responds to the
yeah.
camera that is so beautifully disarming. Like a weird kid in a movie theater seeing that would go, I understand that face. That's the face of something where like grown-ups have been telling you to shush for like 4 months and you're trying so hard to shush, but they keep bringing it up and they won't let it go and let you live your life. Um, that's totally the face.
So you mentioned all this, and the fact is, you mentioned about the everything that she's going through and go to for electroshock therapy at the asylum and such. And I straight away start making connections to Alice Madness Returns, and I can't help but wonder um, how many cues the game took from these concepts of the movie. Do you think there is any? Um,
I would
ins-
have a hard time believing there wasn't.
mm,
Beyond the queer connotation of it, the electroshock therapy is a really elegant way to talk about the time period because we're still doing it now. But in
mm,
1900, it was like this new thing they were doing. They were just really learning about brain stuff. I mean, they had just started washing their hands from surgery at that point, in my mind. So it's one of those things where like it's the idea of fantasy versus modernity. And for me as a
mhm,
writer, it's a really elegant way to discuss it. Because especially in Return to Oz, the doctor takes a moment with his machine that's going to kill Dorothy's brain, and he's like, he goes to it, and he's like, here are the machine's eyes. This is its nose. This is its mouth, and this is its tongue. And like he tries to make it so she's not afraid of the machine, and he will not tell anyone what this machine does. Like Antiam has no idea. Like she knows it's an electric thing, but she's only really seen it in paper. She's not present. She's left Dorothy there overnight. He really won't tell Dorothy what it does except tell her that it will help her sleep more. Like, so it's also, he's keeping secrets, but it's also he doesn't really know what it does. So it works to make him more
Mm,
mysterious, works to make him kind of evil, but not really. And it also kind of takes the idea of what Dorothy experienced with the Tin Woodsman and TikTok as brought to life metal creations.
yes.
It's this really great kind of dystopian science fiction dark fantasy thing that doesn't exist in Neverending Story, because Neverending Story
Mm,
is also pure fantasy. There are no robots in it unless there was some in like the follow-up films.
mm,
And I like that kind of. There's something really great because he's gentle, but he's a little crazed. There's something great about him being a not villain, which is something that has to be deconstructed because we think of villainry as real villain. If anything, if you have to give him like a category of person, he's like a Loki character where they've written
okay.
him both as a villain and an anti-hero. Because
Mm,
I don't know that I mean, obviously he's a bad guy because electrocuting someone's brain is bad, but he doesn't necessarily know he's bad. He's not like the charlatan in Pete's Dragon that wants to kill the dragons so they can harvest them for parts. It's a different villain. He's much closer to like Lady Tremaine from Cinderella, where they can be read as really bad, or they can be read as someone with making do and making bad choices while making do.
mm,
Obviously, it is set up. This insane asylum is not set up. The parlor, the front entrance is very warm and wood, and the further you get into it, it's very cement and bare. But like the nurse herself is not necessarily evil either. She's not vindictive or cruel. She just wants Dorothy to get along and be good. And for a kid, the
yeah.
idea of getting along and being good does create that idea of a villain. But for an adult, it's like there's not really, like, you get Princess Mombi and the Gnome King later on, but for the first half of the movie, essentially,
Yeah.
until Mombi reveals herself as a villain, except for the Willers, there's not a villain for an adult to latch onto. The villain are all kind of kid villains until we get villains,
Mm.
which is really weird to say.
As a quick point, I wonder whether there's an element of sort of like the rise of science intruding into this established fantasy story and its themes from things that we've been saying, and certainly it fits into this dystopian theme of changing the world into a new form that hasn't been seen before. And as you say, science at the time was something completely new that hadn't really been seen by the majority of people. So it was seen as something scary, and especially from probably the perspective of a child.
The other Dark Touchstone release a couple of years, I think after this, actually, maybe the year after this, but Something Wicked This Way Comes also has this kind of technology versus wonder thing, but it approaches it very differently. But the stories are obviously different. The Something Wicked has more of like a everyday diary sort of feel, but kind of the showdown at the amusement park, the use of the technology of the evil Ferris wheel and the evil House of Mirrors, um, does have a little bit of a feel of Return to Oz in it. This idea of technology helping or inhibiting wonder, the idea of what does it mean to live in this world that not everyone can see, this kind of world within a world,
Mm.
and the idea of what is frightening to kids, kind of like the child catcher in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Return
Oh
to
yeah.
Oz Return to Oz explicitly kind of asks that question: can we terrify you? And can kids be terrified? So this is the same question Coraline kind of asks in showing us Other Mother, and then I think her name is Bedlam or Beldam. I can't remember her name.
But I
Um,
think it's damn.
yeah, but it's the idea of these movies that are quote unquote kids movies that aren't afraid of being kind of eccentric and terrifying, and in a way that's camp, but in a way it's also how fairy tales operate more closely when they're read as bedtime stories.
Mm,
Um, because then the kids have kind of the safe anchor of a loved one in the room reading to them. It's something they can
yeah.
participate in. And when I think about Return to Oz as a dark fantasy, yes, but it's explicitly a fairy tale almost as told by children back to their parents. Like the way that Dorothy asks questions, the fact that she just accepts that this talking hen, Belina, talks now because she didn't in the movie when she lived at the farm. She just kind of
Mm.
shows up in the movie after being absent for a few minutes. Uh, and this idea of Jack Pumpkinhead, the idea of asking Dorothy if they are their mom and if they can call Dorothy mom, which Dorothy acquiesces to, which is a really great. So the analogs for Scarecrow, Tin Woodsman, and the Lion are not awful here either. Normally in sequels, that's the first worry, but kind of the this Jack Pumpkinhead, innocent, naive, magic scarecrow jack o' lantern
Mm,
is not grating. Very childlike, but everything in this movie is childlike in its own way. So
mm,
it's not bad. The Tin Woodsman the TikTok as an analog for the Tin Woodsman as this kind of like um 1920s proto trench warfare pot-bellied Winston Churchill type character is was actively created to be something that Tim Woodsman couldn't be, which was violence. Like he's an active war character, and the Gump, who is this living, put together couch moose head with fans, with palm fronds, um, is not the worst lion. They're like, I would much rather not be flying as they're plummeting to the ground. And yes, this movie does show its age on DVD a little bit because the green screen is more visible the older you are when you're watching it. But
mm,
also, it's a movie you really can kind of let yourself get invested in. The Gnome King having this conversation with Dorothy, basically doing a Faustian bargain, being like, I will give you the red slippers if you leave right now, and you won't even participate in this arbitrary game I've created.
mm.
Princess Mombi shrieking and taking off her head is totally like a kid created thing. No
Yeah.
adult's gonna take that seriously. That's totally like a kid is just like spitballing ideas for a villain, and the thing they can think of is like the villainess taking her head off. It's like it's something that meets kids on their own terms for what is
Mm,
scary, and also is kind of a conversation about how all kids, not just queer youth, but all kids,
mm,
kind of learn to deal with fear through fairy tale. I think there's something very queer about Return to Oz that really speaks to kind of the generation that then become horror fans that kind of fall in love with Freddy and Jason, and for me, like haunted house movies like The
mm,
Haunting. Because it does the castle itself. I thought about this. It does have a very um, not the remake with Catherine Zeta-Jones, but the '60s The Haunting, with this kind of mansion with all these different rooms, and you don't see most of them, so you kind of guess what's going on. Um, there's this really great thing that this version of Oz has in the castle with all of the first floor rooms are rooms within rooms. Like you have to see it visually. The idea of these walls are mirrors and Princess Ozma is trapped there. Dorothy doesn't know this, but the floor is like this really slick reflective surface. The walls are these different mirrors. The closet where Mombi keeps her head is this place of mirrors. The only solid room is this kind of evil castle turret where she's going to keep Dorothy until she's old enough where she can like lop off her head and keep it as the next head she's going to wear. So there's something really fantastical and frightening and whimsical about this. And it's also because it's a sequel and they didn't go storybook, they made Oz smaller, but I think that works in context of how big the first movie was, is how small it truly is now that Dorothy's back. And it's never explained if she's remembering it now correctly, quote
Mm,
unquote, or if it's the idea of is Oz in her head, also the idea of how big is Oz, how much has it changed? Because like, oh yes, we're in the Deadly Desert. Deadly Desert isn't in the 39 movie, but it's in some of the books, I think. And it's the idea
mm,
of, well, Dorothy's the authority, but even she doesn't know what's going on around here.
yeah,
It's such a good dark fantasy movie by kids for kids. It's like how The Princess Bride or Robin Hood Men in Tights is that story, but for adults. This is the opposite of that, where it's by kids for kids, and it works in this weird, fantastical way, especially for queer people that really identify with
yeah.
not just Dorothy Gale's Judy, but Dorothy Gale, Fairuza's version.
As
So,
mm, Dorothy Gale as sort of like an archetype dreamer that like has these great big imaginations and like looks beyond what her life is and imagines what it could be. And certainly at that during the period it was written, I imagine there was a lot of young queer people that could identify with that. Like you go, you know, an escapism from what their mundane lives were, or imagining what it would be like to find their own sort of like their world, as it were. I think it still rings quite true in today's youth as well, and for a lot of people that grow up and they can see what the story's trying to tell. Um, in a way, I think people can identify even with like the more cynical dystopian elements of it because he really does come he can really read as um your dreams and your imagination being challenged by more harshness and reality sort of setting in there, if that makes sense.
well,
um
and Dorothy
and
Gale here is much more polite and patient
mm,
than Judy's Dorothy is. Fairuza's Dorothy like does little curtsies at people and is like waiting for them to ask questions before she talks over them. Whereas
mm,
Judy's Dorothy felt a little impatient and a little rude um, in some of the opening scenes, especially. Fairuza's
mm,
Dorothy is almost formally polite. Um, like, and she takes everything with good humor, but there's like a real interesting formal politeness that seems to be ingrained in her version of Dorothy, which you don't see with Judy's version.
would you say that's a mark of like maturity or just a different adaptation of the character?
I think it's a different adaptation. Fairuza talked in an interview about how she was not trying to be Judy, even though they kind of dressed her up like Judy. The costume is different enough. The pigtails look different enough. But she does have some Judyisms just in how
Mm,
iconic Judy was and how when you
yeah.
embody a character like Dorothy Gale is a very specific character in the
Mm,
way that even Sabrina the Teenage Witch is not. Because Sabrina
mm,
can be morphed into the universe she's in. Dorothy Gale kind of
mm,
has to be not naive, but has to have this innocence, has to have kind of this simple beauty, has to have charm. One thing they talk about in both Oz films is the idea, and this is in the Wicked book too, of how charming Dorothy is, of how disalarmingly charming this kind of avatar of goodness coming into Oz is,
mm,
and how that changes and influences what Oz is like. And it does muddy the water on whether or not Dorothy invented Oz or if she's just a frequent traveler whose heart is there. But as you get further along in the books, her heart is not really there. She's just like, oh, I'm back in Oz. Oh no, I'm going home again. At some point, you just wonder, why not just stay in Oz? You're now a princess of it. Why not just stay? Kind of thing. Belina does stay because she doesn't want to be fried into a fricassee, as she is threatened like 2 or 3 times in her non-talking form. Um, there's just something really great about Return to Oz, and it's one of those things where I really want to talk about and deconstruct it, but I also don't because it's one of those movies that has kind of a preciousness to it. Like I could rip the Chipmunk Adventure to pieces, probably don't know that I would. Like it, Return to Oz for me, it's not sacred, but there's something about this where when you watch it, you have to meet it on its own terms, and you have to be
Yes.
okay with doing that. You can't do the YouTube screen rants um, thing with it where you like just break it down and make fun of it because that's not what it's here for.
No.
And there should be some art that is like that. Like
Yeah.
yeah, we could dissect Doctor Who into why it doesn't work and why is he always in England and blah blah blah. But that's not what Doctor Who is about. That's not what
No.
it's for, and that's not the point. And
Mm,
so it doesn't do a service to like deconstruct it and be like, this is the main fault of this movie.
no.
Um, that's not what
It,
I'm
it
here for either. So
no. It doesn't do to take it and subject it to a cinema sins, shall we say?
yeah, CinemaSins was a for yeah, and that is kind of this wave of feeling like you're too good and you're smarter than movies, for
Mm,
me. But the fact of the matter is, a movie, good or bad, like I love Dick Tracy the film. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's not meant to be. And it's also about being able to love something that isn't perfect. Like the green screen on the DVD Blu-ray cover, like you really see the green screen in Return to Oz hard when she's
yeah.
traveling. But then she's on a soundstage on a set and it's not that bad. And then you get,
Mm,
if you hate the movie, you miss the beautiful, panicked, disorienting tracking shots. You missed your Blair
mm,
Witch moments.
yeah.
You know, if you don't let yourself get scared by the Birdman Wheeler creatures that don't have hands, but they can come and get you, and they want to repeat. Like, yes, she gets a key from Oz at the beginning of the movie so she can hide from the Wheelers. But you know what? It's okay. It's a fairy
Mm,
tale, and that's how it works. It's like, don't pull the thread on Don Bluth's version of Anastasia. Just enjoy Once Upon a December. It's okay to just
no.
enjoy things, you know?
Mm,
And that's 85's Return to Oz. Like, it's okay to be afraid, but also to kind of enjoy the dystopia and the weirdness.
mm,
It's a kind of movie where the poster of it with them on Gump traveling would be great as like a birthday cake for someone that really loved this movie for like a 35th birthday. Because it's made as a tableau, it's made as a piece of art, but it's a weird piece of art,
mm,
so it's not for everyone, which is great
no.
too.
Mm, that what you just said, it's a piece of art that's not made for everyone, but it's made for those who would enjoy it.
Yeah.
Um, I completely agree. And there's quite a few things I can think of that are similar in that way. I remember the first time I watched Scott Pilgrim versus the World, the film. I really enjoyed it because I felt it was the perfect version of a manga turned into a film version. Now I know that's not for everyone. Like seeing over the top like
Yeah.
fights and what have you. That's not everyone's thing, but that was almost to me the perfect version of that kind of experience that I was after. Um, and I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that
Uh,
really
Little
jumps out.
Miss Sunshine is that for me. Little Miss Sunshine was really
Mm,
hard the first watch, but the second watch worked really well.
mm,
When I think about people that like Wes Anderson movies,
yeah.
when I think about my kind of weird love hate relationship with the Royal Tenenbaums. I think about
Mm,
that. And Return to Oz is part of a Disney tradition of movies that kind of work but
yeah.
shouldn't work. Kid in King Arthur's Court is one that I thought of. Angels in the Outfield doesn't make any sense at all, but it's an amazing movie. The Parent Trap, all of the versions of the Parent Trap are certifiably insane about these parents splitting up the kids that are twins. In fact, so much it gets mocked, but the movie by itself was both doing something technologically and with the brand that works on its own merit. And when we
Mm,
deconstruct things we love, like when we get around to talking about Buffy, we have to think about it
Yeah.
on its own merit and the time it was. And yes, there is the
Yeah.
shadow of Joss, but for what Buffy did and what Buffy is and what it means to especially the queer fans, you can't
Yes.
ignore that it existed. You can't ignore Return to Oz as Return to Oz had to have some influence on the American McGee's Alice video games. The
Oh yeah.
the Spawn line of Wizard of Oz kink toys that were done, um, that I only
Pardon.
ever saw once in Spencer's. They're amazing. But they're
The
like,
the sorry, the what?
so I don't remember if it was Spawn or if it was just Luke McFarlane that did this, but there was a line of grown up Wizard of Oz toys that had like this kink BDSM feel to them. So like Dorothy had a
Okay.
blindfold on, and the scarecrows being pecked apart by crows. Like it's a very visceral thing, and so Return to Oz kind of gives
Wow.
permission to go to those kind of weird kinky, even more queer versions. That's something like even the Once Upon a Time Wizard does, or the Supernatural Wizard of Oz didn't do. You
Mm.
have to kind of go outside of mainstream to make it okay and permission to be for Oz to be what it is for you, for you as Dorothy, as an analog, as a different version of Dorothy. In a way, the reason Wicked the book works more for me than Wicked the stage show is that Wicked the stage show is overproduced, it's a little too pop. Wicked the book feels more like a Return to Oz in book form, and the sequels even more so. The third one's not as good as the first two, but there's something about Return to Oz and the way that you interact with it as a film, which kind of tells you how much you can suspend, like how much you enjoy Doctor Who is going to be based on how much you enjoy Return to Oz, essentially. How much you're willing to be like, I accept this art on its own terms. And that's something you kind of has to learn because otherwise you end up going in the CinemaSins direction
Oh
and you just
yeah.
start ripping things apart because you think it makes you cool. And in fact,
Well,
ripping Return to Oz apart wouldn't make you cool. It would just make you a dick because
yeah.
the point of it is not that it's necessarily there's nothing wrong with the continuity of the movie, and if you're just
No.
going to rip it apart because you can see green screen a little bit and it's imperfect,
Mm,
was made
yeah.
in 1985. Like, I don't know what you want from people from
Yeah.
19 they didn't have DVDs, they barely had
No.
VHSs back then. And also Walter Murch almost got fired because of how much movie this money cost to Disney Studios to make, along with how much money they were spending to get their two scenes with the ruby red slippers. Um, I think at the end, my takeaway really is
Mm,
not just for you as someone that hasn't seen it, but that
yep.
it's kind of this thing where depending upon how you view the work a fairy tale does in telling a story, is how
Mm,
you'll enjoy Return to Us. If you need a Cinema Sins where you need to rip it apart, then it's probably not going to be for you.
no.
But there's an inherent queerness where it's queer and it's camp, but it's not queer camp. It doesn't quite live in the same space as Hocus Pocus. It lives in a different version of that space where it's more
Mm,
about the dystopia and darkness, and it's more about the ensemble cast than it is any one person. But
yeah.
Fairuza Balk does keep this. Fairuza Balk has amazing presence in this movie, um, and it's a movie I think about, and I don't watch it every year. It's not like White Christmas for me, but it's a movie like every other year or so. Like I have
Yeah.
an itching to watch it, and I put the DVD in, I pop some
Mm,
popcorn, and it's
yeah.
an hour out of my life, and it's nice, and it's kind of this reminder of how wonderful, weird, and dark childhood was when you start asking yourself big
Yeah.
questions. It doesn't feel abusive like Matilda felt. Matilda's like way too in my face with the abuse. Return to
Mm,
Oz is just a story about a search for self that makes sense in a way,
yes.
and in a fairy tale.
And it sounds as if the way you were just saying about revisiting it sounds like it is a fairy tale in that sense. You know, it's a classic tale that you pick up every now and again and you want to experience again. You want to remind yourself and refresh your memory about it. And in a way that harkens back to what many people have done, not just in this last century with films and such, which is, it's still the new medium
Yeah.
compared to of books and literature which have been around far longer. But even then, people were still going back in the past with their books and literature, revisiting things that really stood out from them from there. And even before that, one us wanting to hear our favorite stories again from local storytellers and such. So in a sense, you're continuing a tradition like that, and it shows that there's a certain staying power within Return to Oz that all good stories have.
Also, this would be a great thing to do as a group cosplay. Like, I cannot express to you how, because it wouldn't be as difficult as getting pitch perfect for the other Oz from the 1939 MGM. Return to Oz's costumes are both specific, but you could generalize it enough
Oh,
where if you wanted a group of friends to get together to do like a weird one off, people are going to have to guess what you are. Return to Oz is a great way to celebrate weird culture. Like just having someone come in, wheel in like a hall of heads as Princess Mombi, and then have somebody come in on the Gump settee flying through the air. I mean, come on, it practically writes
has
itself as a group costume. It's amazing.
has anyone on the Boodlin brothers? I think is it the Boo?
The
Oh, I
Boulin
think
brothers who do
yes. Has,
Dracula,
yeah. Has anyone on their show ever done a inspired by costume for
Landon
Return?
Cider did a Tin Woodsman chopping up Dorothy, which is was
Oh,
a fantastic uh, finale look they did as part of their finale. I think it was for their horror part of their horror finale look.
wow,
Where they actually like ate Dorothy's heart on stage. It's incredible if you've
wow.
never seen it. And Landon Cider is a drag king, and so it wasn't just about the performance of that. It was because
Mm,
drag kings never get enough visual or credit. But yeah,
yeah.
Return to Oz would make a great Boulet Brothers theme, the dystopian version of Oz. This presents, especially because it's a mix of fantasy and sci-fi that you don't see. Like if you think about a dark
Mm,
fantasy film like Labyrinth or Willow, they really do push that fantasy, and they don't really. The closest fantasy sci-fi hybrid would end up being Tin Man, where Richard Dreyfuss plays that opium addicted wizard. If you've
mm,
never seen Tin Man with the Deschanel sister, whose name I can never remember, um,
mm,
and Neil McDonough as the Tin Man and Richard Dreyfuss as the wizard, and Alan Cumming as a scarecrow with no brain, literally no brain, like he's got a zipper in his forehead. Tin Man is the only version of Oz that actually does something similar to what this does, but it was done as a sci-fi miniseries, so it's not quite the same. It ages up Dorothy again, so it has more of an adult feel to it. But Return to Oz is a
mm,
great way to do the kids' version of it, essentially.
mm. Excellent. And I shall end on note, if Shudder is listening to this, then you know what theme you should take for Dracula next time.
If Dracula wants to ask me for theme ideas, call me. I have plenty of them. Maybe one
Uh,
day I'll be big enough and lucky enough that I can be on Dracula's radar, because I would that would be a fun life goal, is eventually to be a guest judge. If I don't end up in the contest myself, I don't know if I could go through the exterminations. I don't know that I'm that brave, but I would love to talk about Dracula in context at some point.
mm,
But that's for
yeah,
another show at another time. I
yes.
had a lot of fun talking about Return to Oz today. I hope you learned a lot about it.
I certainly did. It's made me intrigued more to see it for myself now.
I
But I
don't know if
think
it's on Disney Plus, but it's on Disney Plus in US. I don't know if it's on Disney
mm,
Plus in UK, but it is a Disney film. So it should be on Disney Plus if it's not on yours. And if it's not,
ooh,
call to whoever you need to and
I
complain
am
until they put it on.
I am looking forward to seeing them doing it as DLC for Dreamlight Valley.
Oh my God, that would be so much fun. Yeah, I don't think I feel like of all the Disney properties, we're going to eventually. I actually, in Disney Dreamlight Valley, I chose Ratatouille for my first land because I want Remy in my little world, because I have my little Remy statue in my kitchen. But that again is another conversation for another time.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for joining our discussion. Hope you have a rest of your spooky October. We'll do another spooky episode that'll be released on October 25th. And then we'll start doing some fun interim holiday stuff until we hit the actual winter holiday seasons. And we have a list of things to choose from. But there may be some Bob's Burgers Christmas episodes coming up because I think
Oh,
they're just fantastic. So, spoiler alert, and we will catch you next time. Bye.
farewell.